Hi, I'm Joseph Howell. I'm going to explore the diminished scale. Last week I looked at some of the sonic and rhythmic elements of playing jazz. This week I'm going to look at our harmonic and melodic device, the diminished scales. The diminished scale is a symmetrical scale, and it goes, one version goes whole step, half step, over and over and over. Those are the intervals. Whole step, and then half step, whole step, half step. If I don't repeat notes, that'd be whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, then one more half step brings me back to the first note of an octave. And the other version of the scale just reverses that. It goes half step, whole step, until you get to the top. Okay? I don't know where I learned this from, or even if I did, but in the way I think of it is I think of whole step, half step as the diminished scale, and half step, whole step version as the inverted diminished scale. That way I have a distinct name for each one, and in classical theory they call these scales octatonic scales. What you can do, if that's confusing to you, instead of looking at each pair of notes, look at each four notes, okay? So if you take any minor scale, the first four notes would sound like this. And this scale does that over and over and over, up minor thirds. Okay? Or you could just think, do that twice, once off the beginning and once off a tritone up. So that'd be C minor tetrachord. Sounds fancy, but it's simple. And F sharp minor tetrachord. And then the octave to finish off nicely. And then the other version of the scale, this one is a weirder tetrachord. So it would have the root, then kind of like a flat second, a sharp second, and then a major third. And then you would again do it off the root, and then do it again off of the E tritone. And then the octave from the first note. Okay? Jazz, a lot of times, the way we come up with the scale to use for a chord is we kind of say, I guess, to ourselves, or maybe no one ever did this, but whatever, this is the way to explain it. Whatever you do to the chord is what you would do to the major scale. So that's why if you have a minor major seventh chord, which is just a major seventh chord with a lowered third, that's what jazz people usually like to do to the scale as well. Just play a major scale with a lower third. And that's the upward part of the classical melodic minor, but in jazz we just use it up and down, so that's jazz melodic minor. For minor seventh chords, which is lowered third, lowered seventh, the scale we like is very simply a major scale with a lowered third and lowered seventh, which is Dorian. And I really think that that's why. It's just that real kind of simple, you do to the scale what you do to the chord. For a diminished chord, you could almost use that way of thinking. There's just a few notes added in if you're thinking that way. So if you take a major scale, we know that we need, in order for the scale to fit over a diminished triad, we need to lower the third and lower the fifth. So what would happen to a major scale if you just did that? And actually, that's almost the scale right there. There's just one more note. And I think instinctively you could come up with that because once you hear the kind of symmetry, you kind of want that note in there, I feel like. Think of all these kind of relationships mostly from the first scale, the whole half. Because the other one really is just kind of either starting this scale on the second note or kind of flipping around and inverting it, but we'll talk about that later. So the other way to come up with this scale is to take the diminished seventh chord, and you're going to play a half step before each of these tones. You're going to play a half step below it, so chromatic lower neighbor, kind of like a little leading tone for each note. So if I have these notes, I can precede all of them with a half step below. So actually, let's start with this note, not precede it because it's the first note, and then proceed the octave. That's the scale. It's that simple. So, you know, a lot of people are used to that kind of lower neighbor treatment on major triads. Stuff like that, you know, in Dixieland especially. So this scale is just doing that to the notes in a diminished seventh chord. The trick is you just gotta have it very clear in your mind what these notes are, so that when you proceed them by a half step below, you won't accidentally go to the wrong note. Now, in this kind of thinking, most jazz people, I think it's fair game to play any of the notes of the scale against a chord, and sustained even. So, about this. So if this chord is here, and every other note in the scale is a half step below one of these notes, then it winds up being another diminished seventh chord. So the extensions for a C diminished seventh chord are a D diminished seventh chord. And you can play them all at the same time like that. And the reason why it works is because even though there are quite a few dissonances, like if you put all the notes into the same octave, you'd have, right? Well, the reason it works is because where the half steps are. In jazz, when you're deciding or trying to figure out what extensions you can use, what 9, 11, and 13 you can use over the bottom chord, there's two main rules. I've kind of narrowed it down to this, to use. One is that you can't have more than one half step pair in a row. So if you have C, B, and C, you can't have C and C sharp. They need to be separated by at least a whole step. So C and B, D and E flat, F and F sharp, A flat and A. And that's exactly what's in the diminished scale, by the way. The other rule is that whatever your important tones are in a chord, usually it's at least the third and the seventh. We don't usually care as much about the root and the fifth sometimes, but they are important a lot of the time. But in any case, whichever chord tones you're deciding to care about the quality of, you can clash below the note, but you can't clash above the note. And what I mean is if you're using octave equivalents. So in other words, we like major seventh intervals, not minor ninth intervals. Minor ninth intervals are seen as ruining the bottom note's function, I guess, or quality. So again, your half step clashes need to be at least a whole step apart. You can't just keep doing that in traditional theory, or traditional harmony, whatever. And the other thing is that if you're going to have a half step off of something, you could have a half step against every single chord tone as long as it's not a half step above making flat ninth intervals, but making major seventh intervals by being a half step below. So again, C, you could have a B above it. You could have a D above an E flat. You could have an F above an F sharp. You could have an A flat above an A. And that's exactly what this scale does. So it's very, very dissonant, but it's laid out the correct way. That's because in harmonization, we prefer the sound of major seventh intervals to minor ninths. Now in that context it sounds about the same amount of dissonance, but in a chord you would hear it. So that works for having D diminished 7 over C diminished 7. Now, at some point you're going to discover, you probably already have if you're watching this video, that C diminished 7 is the same notes as E flat diminished 7, is the same notes as F sharp diminished 7, is the same notes as A diminished 7. Okay? And that would be true of the entire chord. So this has the same notes as this, as this, as this, and then we're back at the first one. Those all have the same 8 notes in them. Okay, so that's for the whole half. What happens with the half whole is that you would have, if you thought the same way, you would have now the C diminished 7 on top of a B diminished 7. So a half step above. And remember, we don't like that. So what happens is you have to keep all the same notes, but switch, except for the root, switch these notes down here, these notes down here. That way we get, instead of, right now I have minor ninth intervals, but what we want, right now we have minor ninth intervals, but ideally what we want is major seventh intervals, again when we have half steps in a thing. So take these notes, I'll put them down here like this, and then the notes that were down there I'll put right here. And now I won't repeat the octave, we don't need it. Now if I look at what notes that makes a dominant chord, a B7 chord. And if you look at the extensions you can have with it, you can have flat 9, you can have sharp 9, you can have sharp 11th, and you can have natural 13. The scale does have the fifth in it, and you can either leave that in or not. Fifths aren't usually highly sought after in jazz voicings. They're not wrong. There it is. So in most cases, unless you really want to get a dark sound, you'd probably only use 1 or 2 of these extensions at the top. Okay? So therefore, the diminished scale, as I call it, goes over diminished chords. The inverted diminished scale, remember that's the half-whole variety, goes over dominant chords. When you want the sound of a natural 13 and or natural 5th and altered ninths. Okay. Now, with the diminished scale, I showed you that these have the same collection notes to go up minor thirds. That's also true of the 13 altered ninth natural 6th sound. The dominant 13 altered ninth sound. So that's a B13 flat 9. Here's a D13 flat 9. Here's an F13 flat 9. Here's an A flat 13 flat 9. Okay, those all use the same scale. So some people have what they call a diminished matrix, where they start thinking that because of this, for example, G7 is sort of equivalent to a B flat 7, which is sort of equivalent to a D flat 7, because all the stuff means minor third relationships. That really isn't that deep or even that useful. I mean, what you get from it is if you if you use that to then make a 2-5 out of that 5 chord, then that means if you're going to C major, you can do D minor 7 to G 13 flat 9 to C major 7. That's one way to get to C. You can go F minor 7 to B flat 13 flat 9 to C. that's not that uncommon. We often have a flat 7 to 1 in jazz as a cadence. The other relationship that you get is that you could play A flat minor 7 to D 13 flat 9 to C major, and that's just a tritone sub for the usual 2/5. The one that's the most exotic, and I think it's probably only in like an Eric Dolphy tune or two, is that you could also then theoretically go B minor 7 to E 13 flat 9, or how about sharp 9 this time, to C major. So that one's a little bit more exotic. It's good, whatever scale you're going to have, to number one, run it all up and down your instrument. Since these scales are symmetrical, there's only 3 different ones. I should have mentioned that for each form. So for the whole half, you have the one starting on either C, E flat, F sharp, or A, then C sharp, E, G or B flat, and D, F, A flat, or B, because those are all the same. And then you have the same 3 for the half-whole variety, okay? So run those on your instrument, because anything in theory that you can't actually perform on your instrument, what's the point of that? The knowledge isn't going to do anything for you unless you can make sound out of it, okay? Then the next thing to do is, in jazz, we have this cool thing where you can get exotic sounds from any era, anything in your head, over really kind of dumb Broadway tunes that we play, like There'll Never Be Another You. So what that means is we have to come up with ways to relate exotic scales to really basic chords, like major 7th, minor 7th, dominant 7th. So for dominant 7th, as we've established, you would use the half-whole, the inverted diminished, because it has the root, the 3rd, and the 7th in the scale, mostly. And then the other notes don't conflict with the quality of the chord. If you want to use it over a minor 7th, like if it's in a 2/5, what you can just do is start using the one that you're going to use over the 5 chord early over the 2 chord. So if you look at that, that means you're going to play the whole half variety over the 2 chord. So that would be, if it's a D minor 7th, play D whole half. So you're almost kind of imagining that you're playing D diminished 7 over D minor 7. In context, it could be whatever, not a great example, but that's it. Okay, so for major chords, the way people kind of use that is to imply a major triad based off the major 7th over the chord. So if you would normally have a C major 7, the kind of sound we would like to imply if we use a diminished scale over this is a B triad over a C in the bass, which if you think about it is a C diminished major 7. Now I'm sure most of you have noticed that in harmonically, the traditional diminished 7th chord, actually the 7th that they're using is a 6. It's not a 7th at all, right? So the 7th that we like to use in jazz sometimes is actually the major 7. So you'd have the bottom triad, and then you add the major 7, which would be a triad, a half step down from the root of the chord you're playing. So this is a C root, so I'm playing a B triad on top in first inversion. Okay? So the scale that would work for all that would be the whole half starting on C. So you're actually thinking playing C diminished 7 over C major 7. That doesn't mean, when I say that, I'm just giving you a concept. That doesn't mean you're going to play like that necessarily, okay? It just means that when you're making up your melody or even your voicing, it's going to be from those pitches, okay? Now, when you have a major seventh, the triad from the major seventh over a root, there are other implications. I think I should point that out. One is in this case to be the sixth mode of harmonic minor. So that would be E harmonic minor. Those notes are all in there. So that, in fact, in a lot of contemporary theory books, when they talk about the octatonic scale, which is the diminished scale, they start talking about the right of spring chord and other Stravinsky things. Now, the right of spring chord, I don't remember which octave it's in, but it's E flat 7 first inversion over an E triad. So here's the E triad, here's the E flat 7 first inversion, dominant 7, and they're played together. I think it's an octave down. Yeah, it is. Now the thing is, that's not the diminished scale at all, or the traditional octatonic scale. And the wrong note is the top note. Now if this note was moved 1/2 step down or up, it would be diminished. But it's not. Okay? And what it actually is the sixth mode of harmonic minor, just like what I'm showing you, B over C could imply. And if you don't believe me, here's the scale from that. I just played the scale, A flat harmonic minor. In the registration, it's in there. Okay? It's still related to diminished scale as I'm showing you, especially the way it'd be used, but just keep that in mind. So sometimes when you play a B triad over C, it might actually be a B triad over a C triad, which is more how that was, okay? But in this case, we're thinking, no, it's just B over C, and it's going to imply the most natural implication, which is, okay? So a lot of times that's used, maybe even temporarily. So if I do a 2-5-1, when I get to the 1, I might play diminished major seventh and then move the third and the fifth up to the major chord, like this. Or you might just sit on it. In this case, I added the ninth, which is also the diminished scale. Okay? So that means if I'm playing over a tune, I could play diminished scale over every single chord. Normally you wouldn't want to do that because people would eventually not hear the connection to the tune at all. It would sound a little too much, but you could try it, and you could at least use that as a learning tool. So here would be, so let's go over it. So over a minor chord, you would most naturally use whole half, which again I call the diminished scale. Over a dominant chord, you would use half whole, which I call the inverted diminished scale. And over a major chord, I would use the whole half, which I call the diminished scale. Mainly because of the seventh in the chord. Now, I was kind of moving around with different things in there. Now the thing to do is to get yourself melodically familiar with the scale. This is one of the richest parts about the scale, is that there are a lot of things in it. So let's go to a different key. All right, let's say I have C sharp diminished 7. So that would be this scale. Remember, that's the same as this, as that, and so forth. So let's look at what melodic shapes are in there. One very familiar one to all of us are major triads. So if you're in C sharp diminished 7, you'll have a C triad, and then with most things in the diminished chord, it works to just keep going up minor thirds. So you have C triad, E flat, F sharp, A, and then if you go up again, it'd be C again. Okay? On those same roots, you would have minor triads. On any of those chords that I've learned how to relate the scale, I can play little patterns like that. And so remember, you also have first inversion triads and second inversion, and again in minor, and so forth. Now, if playing that, you might want to give yourself more of a challenge and think about melodic direction. So if you have 3 notes, you don't always have to go bottom, up, up. You could go top, down, down. And once you've climbed up as high as you want to go, you can go back down. And so forth. Once you've gone up as high as you want, you can go back down. How about in minors? So that was the top note, down, down. How about something like bottom note, top note, middle note? Okay, you could do major on the first one, minor on the second one, and so forth. I think I played that right. Also, if you look at the scale, there are, again, we're on C sharp diminished, C sharp whole half. You would have diminished 7th arpeggios, or even just the triads if you want, but I'll do the 7th arpeggios off of each note in the scale. Okay, that'd be a more traditional kind of sound from it. And again, all the same stuff could be applied to the half whole scale. All I'd have to do is change what root is in my left hand. So I had C sharp diminished 7, which uses the same scale as C7, flat 9, or sharp 9, or even just C7. So that'd be C triad, E flat triad, F sharp triad, A triad, C triad, the minors. Okay? So everything you learn about one can be applied to the other. You just have to remember what note the scale starts from, or if it's half whole or whole half. Okay, now we'll get into some other shapes. So a shape that a lot of people tend to like comes from having the triad from the major 7th over a root. Remember that? So you can turn that into arpeggio. So in this voicing, it's in that order, but you could think of it as B triad with a flat 9 added. So that could be one shape you could do also. Okay, so that's in that inversion, or whatever you want to call it. But people seem to really like this one too. I'll do a little bit of change of direction too for variety's sake. Now piano's not my instrument, so hang in there. Clarinet is my main instrument. Okay. The next one that's very related to that is like taking a major triad that's in the scale and adding the sharp second in it, which could be a shape you do on its own again too. position, what it winds up being is a major triad in first inversion, and then you put the sharp ninth on top. Or you can think of it as a minor, major 7, sharp 5. Okay, so going up that would be. Okay, and remember this would be, do all of this in all 3 keys of the diminished, and then relate it to the half whole as well, in all 3 keys again. Another shape that's nice is the, let's call it major 7th, sharp 5, sus 2. So you have a whole step at the bottom, and a minor 3rd interval that goes up to the major 7. So 1, 2, sharp 5, major 7. So in this key it'd be. Okay. Another shape that's nice is a major triad plus the sharp 4. Especially if you put it in second inversion. The triad in second inversion. And put the sharp 4 on top. Okay. Then you can just bring out little intervals. The scale has whole steps in it. You can bring that out as a horn player by playing some of the, there's a popular pattern that actually does that. Whole step, and then skips one of them. Whole step, then go back to one you skipped. Whole step, and then you continue that pattern. I think nowadays some people consider that pattern so obvious and overplayed that it's, don't do it. But if you find a tasteful way to use it, of course, do so. There's also fourths in the scale, so I'm going to stay in C sharp. So I'm doing perfect fourths going up minor thirds. And I ended on the root. There's also major 7th intervals. There's also flat 9th intervals. I find some of those especially effective on the clarinet. Sounds pretty crazy. You can also come up with little things where you do a tritone and then a fourth, so then it winds up being, that's the interval stacking. The chord would be like a diminished triad, a diminished major 7 without a 3rd. And again, you can change the direction, hopefully. And so forth. Also, there are little patterns that people play. Let's see, what's one? What's nice about that one is it kind of brings out the tetrachords that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so what you want to do in the end is apply it to a tune structure that you're playing on. One thing I should mention about these patterns, a lot of people, especially sax players, it seems to be a contest to see how far up and down their horn and how fast they can play, how about, or whatever. What I'd recommend, and that I'm trying to get into sometimes, is just pick 1 or 2, stay in a range, and try to just move it side to side a little bit for each chord quality. For example, how about I try using it on a tune? Something else. So this time I'm going to do it again, but not try to be around one pattern. But I'm going to play diminished scales that are related to each chord. So that was kind of over the changes to confirmation. As you can see, it's a very dark color. This time I'll mix it in more with a little bit more traditional playing too. Traditional scale to chord relationships. Okay, now to get to weirder stuff, what you can also do, think about it, the scale has 8 notes, and there are 12 notes total if you have enharmonic and octave equivalents. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that means only 4 aren't in the scale. And those 4 are another diminished 7th chord. So there's the bottom, here's the usable extension, the next note, the next set is the one that's missing, and then you have all 12 notes. So a really easy way to play kind of a 12-tone vibe is in your head to think, I'm going to go between 2 of the diminished scales. And what's interesting is that when you do that, the 2 diminished scales, no matter what, will have 4 notes in common, 4 notes not in common. Okay? So, I don't need to give a million examples of that, or a long one, but if you just imagine 2 different diminished scales at the same time playing however many notes of each before you switch. Whatever. And then Messiaen has another symmetrical scale. I think that's how you say his name, I have no idea. That is, say if you had the whole half scale, you add a tritone interval that's half of the missing diminished seventh chord. So in this case, the missing chord is C sharp diminished 7. So you have one tritone off the root of that, and one tritone off of the third of that. What that winds up being is, if you do it in C, you're going to play C whole half plus C sharp and G. So it's C whole half plus flat 2 and natural 5. And that just gives you something for your mind to hold on and sort of give yourself permission to play these notes. Obviously, if you're playing that way, if another note of the last two slips out, no one's going to care in improvisation at least. So then the other location of the other half that would be symmetrical would be to add E and B flat in there. So it'd be C whole half plus major third and flat 7. Let's see. Okay? Okay, so I hope that gives you some sort of idea of how to use diminished scales, the different colors they can bring out. I didn't talk about it, but you probably heard them. And how to apply them over tunes, how to bring out little melodic things out of them, shapes. I think eventually I'm going to do another one on the augmented scales as well, so stay tuned.